Now we move, of course, to Australia, my home country. It's the centre of the documentary On the Precipice, which is a film that examines the mysterious deaths of a large number of gay men who died there in the late 80s and 90s. The film follows a family's investigation of the death of Scott Johnson. That's an American who passed away in 1988, which, like many other suspicious deaths at that time, was ruled a suicide. Not satisfied with the ruling, his family embarked on what would become a decades-long search for the truth. Take a look at a clip.
From then on, the wonder about what happened to Scott has always been there. I didn't know whether my brother had chosen to leave us. I didn't know whether someone had pushed him. I didn't know whether he had slipped. I didn't know why we lost Scott.
Joining us now is the brother of the late Scott Johnson, Steve Johnson. Steve, tell us how this investigation began.
Thank you, Josh. In 1988, I was a graduate student in Boston studying at Harvard, and I got a phone call. My brother had moved to Australia a few years earlier to carry on his studies. And it was a call from his boyfriend who told me that his body had just been found at the bottom of a cliff in Manly, which is a beach town just outside of Sydney.
And what was the conclusion at the time?
Well, I scraped some money together, borrowed some money. I was a poor student at the time. Got on a plane, went to Sydney. The police took me up to where they said Scott had jumped, said that it was a common place for jumping, particularly for homosexuals. They looked at me quizzically to ask me if I knew my brother was homosexual. I certainly did. He came out to me just a short time after he came out to himself. In fact, he moved to Australia because he fell in love with somebody when he was studying at Cambridge University. So he was there to be with his boyfriend. And the police had already decided it was suicide, told me this is where gay people go to jump, and that's what my brother did.
What was your hunch?
Well, first of all, it was to me and his friends and his boyfriend extraordinarily unlikely that Scott would have chosen that day to go jump from a cliff. He had just talked to his professor earlier that day. I was the last person that we knew of who had talked to Scott, who gave him the all clear on the last proof that he had been working on for his math PhD. And his professor said, that all sounds right. Why don't you take a break and let's meet in my office in a couple of days to go through it very carefully. And that was the last contact we know of. His body was found a couple of days later, but he hadn't been seen after that. So I had nothing but a huge question mark. The police were telling me one thing, that this was the suicide spot in Sydney, and all other factors. My brother was a happy, a very happy young man, idealistic, brilliant. He was the smart one in the family, was graduated from the top of his class at Caltech. He had a very bright academic future, and his professor had just told him that the months of work that he had just been engaged in had come to a successful conclusion. So my feeling is he would have put his pencil down to go look for some way to celebrate, some way to have fun. So I just couldn't add it all up. I was completely mystified and heartbroken.
And where does the investigation stand now? I know that the Australian media has started pushing the New South Wales Police to reopen the investigation and to look into these deaths a bit more. What's next?
Well, so after the shocking thing that happened, the police closed the case, wouldn't investigate it. 17 years later, news came to my attention from Sydney that another inquest in Sydney had looked carefully at 3 other gay men who died at the bottom of cliffs in Sydney, that the police also had said were suicides. The coroner very outspokenly reprimanded the police for negligence and misleading the families that those men had been killed by marauding gay hate gangs that would go to these places where gay men would meet and beat them up and sometimes kill them. And so that news reached me. It was a scenario that I never contemplated, that the police never offered to me. And that was 7 years ago, 7 years of hiring my own investigator to go and establish that where Scott died was a beat, was a gay meeting place, that there were scores of other victims who had been beaten up in the gay meeting areas in the northern beaches where Scott died, and dozens of men who had died. So my quest took me back to the New South Wales coroner in 2012, who finally agreed to reopen Scott's case. The police continued to insist this was not violence, but the coroner in 2012 certainly disagreed. And so now we have an investigation ongoing. We are pressing because the New South Wales police are just looking at Scott's case in isolation of all the other cases and all the other violence. We're now pushing for a much broader investigation. We think the best chance for solving Scott's case and bringing justice to all these other young men who died and whose deaths were ignored by the police is to open up a much broader investigation. Have my call is to New South Wales to devote the resources for a very thorough investigation of all these cases. Many of them are linked because these were gangs that would go to these places every week and then brag about it afterwards. So there are many people who know what happened. So there's, even though this was a long time ago, many of these people who were involved are still living in Sydney, and these cases can be solved and justice can be brought.
Good luck with it, Steve. Thanks for bringing it to our attention. I'll have my producer put you and I in touch just in case there's any way that I can help at all. Thanks for being with us, and I hope you get some closure.
Thank you very much, Josh.
On the Precipice is airing tonight and tomorrow on the World Channel. Check your local listing for more info on where you can catch the film.